Hi everyone and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Mark Lambert and I'm joined today by Professor Larry Chapp, who's direct from Rome. How you doing, Larry?
I'm doing great, having a good time here in Rome.
How long have you been there now?
Actually, I've been here since a long time, since April 25th. As soon as the Pope died, I booked my flight immediately because I wanted to be here for the funeral and then the conclave and the installation mass, so the whole bit. So here for about a month.
So are you fully roamed up yet? Have you had enough? Looking forward to getting back to the farm or?
Yeah, I am looking there. It's springtime, and springtime is busy time on the farm. So I'm sort of anxious to get back because I have a lot to do.
Okay, you've written a number of pieces, haven't you, for
Yes.
has it been in First Things and National Catholic Register?
First things, the Pillar, uh, Catholic World Report, and the National Catholic Register. Those four publications. Yes.
So are you feeling really hopeful about the situation?
Yes, I am, and I have to admit, I've got a piece coming out in Catholic World Report. I think later today, Rome time, in which I say that initially, when I was standing in the square after the white smoke came out and they announced the name of Cardinalum Prevost, I was a little disappointed because he was a bit of an unknown to me. Word on the street was that he leaned more towards Pope Francis and his views than the other way. So I kind of was hoping for Cardinal Erdo, of Hungary, or Cardinal Ike of the Netherlands, or Rajith from Sri Lanka, one of the more conservative prelates. But I was happy it wasn't Zuppi or Parolin or anybody like that. So I was just kind of meh. Okay, who's that? I'll have to think about it. But as soon as he stepped out onto the loggia and he was in full papal garb, which to me sent a message that, hey, I'm not Francis Part Two. I admire Francis. I think he thinks, but he's not just going to be a rinse, cycle, and repeat of the Francis papacy. And I think that was a deliberate choice on his part to sort of send that message.
I was saying that I think that we'd sort of talked ourselves into a position where we all had this list of cardinals that we wanted to step out onto loggia, and when it wasn't one of those, we immediately, our initial reactions from a lot of Orthodox Catholics was, "Oh no, they've that sort of the liberal progressives have got Francis too," and it's been like a slow budding in spring that we've been waking up to the semiotics of Cardinal Prevost as given us as Pope Leo, and to recognize the messages that he's sending, which are messages of building a bridge, aren't they? Of, perhaps not breaking the continuity with Francis, but perhaps doing what he was trying to do properly. Is that, I don't know if that's...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm just happy that there were so many people in the square after the white smoke that the data plan on my cell phone didn't work. Nobody's was working because there were just so many people trying to access, cellular data, that it was just didn't work. And I'm glad, because I was about ready to send text message to a lot of friends saying, oh no, geez. But I'm glad I didn't, because I'm actually very hopeful, very impressed with Cardinal Prevost, Pope Leo XIV. Very impressed so far. Now, it's early in his papacy, and the rubber's going to meet the road when we see his first personnel appointments. When, for example, does he fire Cardinal Fernandez from the DDF and replace him with somebody of more theological substance? Let's put it that way. Who's he going to get to replace Supich in Chicago? That's going to be very interesting, of course, because Pope Leo is from Chicago, so he's got a real interest. I'm sure he's going to take a big personal interest in who goes into Chicago, because Cardinal Supich has submitted his resignation. He's 75, and so we'll see. I think that's going to be a very telling appointment, who he puts in.
Two priests as well from Chicago this year, as I understand it, for ordination. One of them is from St. John Cantius, which obviously is most of the vocations, I think, in the Archdiocese. Supich has got to be held accountable for this, hasn't he? That's ridiculous, isn't it?
one would think that he has to be held accountable for the fact that I just saw a meme today, I think it was on X, that compared the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, that's ordaining 12 new men this year, and they only have like 450,000 Catholics in the whole diocese, where Chicago is ordaining 2 men, and they have 2 million Catholics. And that's just really a disgrace. And it's testimony to the fact that Cardinal Cupich has not generated vocations in the way that Cardinal George did.
And why do you think that is? Is it purely down to, is it a case of policy, or is it down to personality to some extent?
Well, I think to some extent personality. But, Cardinal Cupich publicly has his charms. He's not an ogre publicly. And so I don't know if it's his public personality so much as his policies. The fact is, and you know this, Mark, we've seen this for the past 60 years, liberal Catholicism is not self-propagating. It just isn't. It doesn't inspire. I mean, worldwide, under the papacy of Pope Francis, vocations are down. There's been a 12-year cratering of vocations around the world under that pontificate. And I think it's because Pope Francis simply did not inspire young men to give their lives to the priesthood for a message of, what does it matter? It's all the same. All religions are the same. Youth is a time for idealism. I remember when I entered the seminary and when I was a young man, if you're going to live a celibate life, give up marriage and family and devote yourself to this institution, you want to feel like you're part of something grand, something bigger than yourself. There's an idealism there. And you just don't get that in liberal Catholicism. You don't get that grand narrative of the glories of Catholicism. Instead, you get constant harangues and finger wagging about avoiding triumphalism and not, So I don't know. That's my take on it. And I think it's one that lots of, commentators share.
Do you think then that with this American Pope who has come straight out of the box, I have to say some of his addresses sound very much like Pope Benedict to me. I don't know if you'd agree. Do you think we're going to see potentially an explosion in vocations in the States?
I'm hopeful that the answer to that is yes. Depends on how you define explosion, but I think you're going to see a powerful uptick. I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone, and we were talking about, can you imagine what it's going to be like if and when, and I'm sure he will, visit the United States. And he'll go, hopefully it's a multi-city tour, Chicago and other places. I think it's going to be so energizing to the church in America. I think you are going to see a very, very large increase in vocations to the priesthood in the United States, especially if he visits the United States.
And he must be aware of that, mustn't he? He must be.
Oh, yes. And I think the feeling is this, right? And I'm not saying something that I don't think a lot of people are sharing. The feeling right now is like a huge boulder has been lifted off of our shoulders. We don't, I think, even begin to realize the depth of the demoralization of devout Catholics under the pontificate of Pope Francis. And we didn't even realize how demoralized we were. But I was getting emails all the time, scores, hundreds, from devout Catholics saying, what do I do? I'm having a crisis of faith. I just don't feel anymore. You get the picture. And I think that all of a sudden there's this breath of fresh air, like, oh my, oh dear, this is what it feels like to actually feel as if the Holy Father cares about you. Let's face it, Catholics like you and me, Mark, we always got the impression that Pope Francis just didn't like us, that he just wished we would go away, shut up and go away. He was always saying inclusion, parrhesia, todos, everyone, but really he didn't mean it. He was constantly pushing out, calling us Pharisees, indiatrists, backwardists. And now all of a sudden you've got a man with some charm, a man who understands that he wants to build a bridge and that there are wounds in the church on that side of the church. And I think he's praised Eastern liturgies in his meeting with Eastern Rite Catholics the other day, and talked of a need to restore mystagogy and transcendence to the Catholic liturgy. He spoke of synodality, but he immediately linked it with collegiality, which to me, as a theologian, these are subtle tells. That's, in poker, it's a tell, right? A subtle tell when he immediately links it to collegiality, because one of the criticisms of synodality is that it has marginalized the bishops. It's taken the synod of bishops and turned it into a kind of ecclesial assembly of lay people voting and so forth. And that is really problematic from a magisterial point of view. So I think that his mentioning of collegiality is a way of signaling that he wants to restore the authority of the bishops. A synodal church, yes, 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 yes. But a synodal church grounded in the authority of the episcopacy, of the apostolic succession, and not some freewheeling conversation in a hall around round tables, chit-chatting, about this and that. So there are all these positive vibes that you're getting from this guy right now, and I just feel like the church is going to come alive, and I'm very hopeful for that.
Very exciting. So I think that's a really good point, that the synod on synodality, we kind of got the feeling that it was very vague, didn't we? That there was no real trajectory for it, and that seemed to be a strategy to allow these hot topics that were first of all introduced into the synod and then removed from the sort of the schema of what was going to be talked about, because that seemed to me that you had people like Archbishop Fisher, Archbishop Wilson, Bishop Barron, all speaking out against those issues and saying, well, obviously they're not part of the magisterium. So Francis took them out of the way. Now, it seems that in that comment about synodality, it sounds like what he's going to do is, with his background in canon law, he's going to ground it in proper canonical process and theology. And that will that take the teeth out of the synodal process? I mean, it seems that the synodal process was about, the synod on synodality, let's say, is about constant dialogue, pastoral over doctrinal, and basically finding a way to facilitate introducing these heterodox positions into normal Catholic praxis. Would that be your view?
I think that's right. I think he's going to be very careful. Pope Leo is going to be very careful not to appear to be overtly simply saying, Pope Francis, it was wrong about this, that, and the other thing. It's going to be more subtle than that. He's going to seek a kind of continuity, I think. But in that continuity, he's going to make his own changes. And one of them is he's going to more specifically define, let's hope, what synodality is. And I like your phrase there where you said, take the teeth out of what it's been so far. And what it's been so far is really nothing more than a kind of Potemkin village, a facade that is hiding the fact that the synod is being used as a stalking horse for all kinds of liberal hot button issues that Pope Francis simply allowed to take place. And that can't be that, because that will be undermining the entire thing, as well as, the need to restore the authority of the bishops and not have them have an equal vote with lay people on these issues. There's also the fact there was a performative contradiction at the heart of the Francis papacy, where he would talk synodality, but then he would autocratically rule via his own whim. And Amoris Laetitia, one of the first documents of his pontificate, is an example of this. I mean, the focus was so much on, do we allow the divorced and civilly remarried without an annulment go to communion? And the fact is, the issue was left unresolved, and many, many, many bishops at the Synod of Bishops at that time said, no, we're not going to include anything in the final synodal document about this. Well, then out comes Amoris Laetitia, and in that famous footnote, the Pope just throws in, well, we might be able to allow this after a period of discernment and, accompaniment, and there you go. In an ambiguous footnote in chapter 8, he just says, yeah, we might be able to do this. That's an example of non-synodal papal intervention. If you want to turn it over to the synod participants to make these decisions, then do it. But so it's very clear that he wanted to use the synod to simply advance certain causes. And when those causes were not advanced, he just did it anyway. For example, Fiducia Supplicans came out right after the first synod on synodality, right? And the issue of homosexual blessings had come up, and the bishop said no. We're not going to include that in the final document. 2 weeks later, boom, out comes Fiducia Supplicans, which means they have been working on it while the synod was going on. A lot of bishops were really angry about that. Like, okay, so what's our voice for? Why were we a month in that squalid hall, away from our dioceses if it didn't matter in the end? And that is what demoralized people. And that, I hope and I think, is what's going to change now.
Very interesting that Pope Leo in recent comments said that without justice, there can be no peace. And this is how we build a community, isn't it? This is how we build the church, is if we know that there is a canonical process, if we know that there is theology. One of my friends at the Catenian Association, an older gentleman, said to me when he heard that I'd studied theology, was like, "Oh, well, that's all just making it up as you go along." And one of the things about studying theology is that you find out that it's not that it is a scientific process. And that seems to have been abandoned under Pope Francis now. But do you think that will be restored under Pope Leo? That's one of the things.
Yes, I do. I mean, there was the famous statement from Father Spadaro, SJ, one of Francis's closest advisors, who like 10 years ago said, well, in theology, 2 + 2 can equal 5. Yes. And of course, he was roundly ridiculed for that. But it was just his way of saying, hey, we get to do what we want because we're in charge. That's what he really meant by that. And the fact is, the irony is Pope Francis spent 12 years wagging his finger at the doctors of the law. And now we have a Pope who's a doctor of the law. And hopefully, I mean, as my friend, the journalist Chris Altieri, was all over. I mean, Chris worked in the Vatican for many years at Vatican Radio and now lives in the United States. And he does a lot of freelance writing. And in Catholic World Report and in other venues, he was relentless in his cataloging of how Pope Francis just did not follow the rule of law, that the Vatican had become a kind of law unto itself under Pope Francis, that even laws promulgated by Francis, like Vos Estis, he routinely just ignored or went around and so on. So I think Pope Leo, being a canon lawyer, and like what you just said, there's no peace without justice, understanding that canon law is there to guarantee justice within the church. No more deposing bishops without due process, for example. That kind of thing is going to come to an end.
One of the things that I've struggled with in the last week or so has been the right wing of the church, the more orthodox or the trads. I hate to put labels on people because that is a fruit of the division that we saw under Pope Francis, which yes. I don't feel existed under Benedict. And one of the things that I hope Pope Leo is going to resolve completely. But you've seen a lot of people, a lot of my friends have come out and said, well, he needs to do this immediately. Realistically, he's not going to do that. And he's not going to come out and burn Traditionis Custodes on the loggia, as much as we'd like him to do that. And one of the ways that we've explained this in conversation is like the paradox between Bishop Joseph Strickland and Archbishop Cordileone, for example. So, who both are faithful Catholics. Strickland chose to speak out vocally. And in doing that, I'm not condemning what he did because he stood up to the corruption. He showed the people that there was someone who was prepared to stand up to that corruption and call it out within the US Bishops' Conference. As a result of that, fundamentally as a result of saying that the Pope, was a heretic basically on social media, he was removed from his position, although he's still a bishop. But then you've got Cordileone, who was directly contradicted when he stood up against Nancy Pelosi receiving Holy Communion, yes. Directly undermined by Pope Francis. And yet he kept his cool, he kept quiet, he just kept doing his thing. Now, the way that I see this paradox is, the Bishop of Tyler, thank God for him, stood up and showed us that he was a shepherd. But the result of that was Tyler lost their bishop, their good bishop. And San Francisco kept their good bishop. So the seminaries still have got a good bishop. They've still got the traditional Latin Mass. They've still got, good sound teaching,
yes.
etc. Yes. how do we explain that paradox to, that's prudence, really, isn't it, in leadership? And this is why trads can't expect the Pope to come out and just overturn everything that they don't like, isn't it? He's got to be a gentle process of bridge building, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and the analogy I like to use, I mean, if you're on a hiking trail in the mountains of the United States and you come across a grizzly bear, you back away slowly, pepper spray in hand, but you back away slowly. The thing you don't do is walk up to it and stick it in the eye with a pointy stick. And unfortunately, bishops like Athanasius Schneider and Bishop Strickland decided to follow the latter path, to just take a pointy stick and jab it in the Pope's eye. That lacks prudence. I'm not a huge Bishop Strickland fan, to be honest, but it only underscores the fact that I think he was mistreated. Here you have a man like Bishop McElroy in San Diego, who's openly dissents from Catholic teaching on matters of human sexuality. And an article in America Magazine just flat out says the church's teaching on LGBTQ issues is wrong and needs to change. He's not only not disciplined, he's given a red hat and moved to Washington, D.C. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that were so demoralizing. And Coeur de Leon, I think, had a better sense of things. Bishop Barron has a better sense of things. You bide your time. What's the phrase? You keep your powder dry, and wait for your moment, and wait to make changes, in other ways.
So a lot of the way that we're going to move forward, we should be looking to the appointments of bishops, shouldn't we? Are there any bishops in particular, or archbishops, that you would like to see made cardinals in the next consistory, which will be in 12 months' time?
Yes, I really think that, for example, Archbishop Gomez should be given a red hat in Los Angeles. I think as an honorary thing, I think that retired Archbishop of Philadelphia, Chaput, should be given a red hat. Now, I'm speaking as an American. I can't talk about, other places worldwide. But
that would be a huge signal if that happened, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and for that reason,
they're the biggest ones who are overlooked, really, by Francis, aren't they?
That's right. Well, in the current, all of these major American sees, like Philadelphia and Los Angeles, that traditionally the bishop gets a red hat, they should be given a red hat. I don't know the current Archbishop of Philadelphia very well. I think his name is Perez. I think he should be given a red hat. I think Gomez should be given a red hat. The new Bishop of Boston should be given a red hat. And just restore the fact that the reason why red hats are given to these dioceses, these archdioceses, is because they're important. They're important in the life of the church, not some obscure dissenting bishop in San Diego just because you happen to like his views on homosexuality. That kind of thing has got to end.
Absolutely. It's going to be very interesting to see. One of the things with that is the way that the appointment of Leo XIV has brought us images of, and it unsettled a lot of people. Supich and Tobin were as happy as sort of the more conservative cardinals. So if he does something like that, if he starts appointing the people who are on the opposite side of the church, if you like, to what extent are they on the opposite side of the church? Will it break that support if Gomez, for example, was appointed? Do you think?
No, I think appointing Gomez and people like that would go a long way towards healing divisions in the church. Period. I think that one of Pope Leo's first priorities is going to be to restore proper collegiality, which had been harmed under Pope Francis. Despite all of his talk about synodality, he harmed collegiality by these kinds of arbitrary choices. And I think Pope Leo is going to want to restore collegiality. In that regard, let's take Traditionis Custodes. You said he's not just going to roll it back. I don't think he will either. And it may take some time, but my prediction is this, for what it's worth. I think he's going to restore the order that was not under Benedict and Summorum Pontificum. I think he'll restore kind of like what it was under John Paul, that the Latin Mass can be said by priests if they get the approval of their local ordinary. If they get the approval, that would kill two birds with one stone. It would greatly increase the availability of the Latin Mass to people who want it. And it would signal collegiality, because what he would essentially be saying is, hey, look, I'm not rolling back anything. I'm just restoring authority to the bishops, which is part of the synodal way. So that gives him cover, that I'm simply sort of developing Traditionis Custodes in a more synodal path. And I really think that's the avenue that he's going to go down.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting on that particular issue that he has made lots of noises, hasn't he, already in his first week about liturgy, that makes you think that he does see this.
Yes.
Do you think that's like lex orandi, lex credendi is a foundational part of the way that he sees
Yeah,
role?
not only lex orandi, lex credendi, but lex praxis. In other words, as we pray, so we believe, and therefore so we act. This is a man who was a missionary in Peru for 20 years, dual citizenship in Peru. This is a man who understands being down with, he really did smell like his sheep. He was a man with his flock. I mean, I cannot praise him enough for the depth of character and Christian discipleship he showed by being a missionary for all those years amongst the poorest of the poor. That says a lot about this man. And I really think that he wants to restore not just proper worship and proper belief, but proper Christian discipleship, the living out of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. I think that's going to be very big on his agenda. And look, he takes the name Leo. Leo was known for Rerum Novarum, for starting the church's social teaching. And so issues like that are going to be very big to Pope Leo, issues of social justice. And so I think he really wants to link all of those things together: liturgy, doctrine, practice, all in a nice, neat package that is going to be far more coherent than the last papacy, I believe.
Yeah, that just the amount of time that he must have had to think and put all those things together. Like when you look at the way that he came out, and he had the name, he had an agenda, the things that he said in different languages as well. That shows that he's very intelligent, doesn't it, straight away?
Oh, very much so. He also avoided using English in his, which I think, once again, this is all deliberate. None of it is by accident, where he chose not to speak in English, I think, in order to underscore, yes, I'm an American, but now I'm Pope. And I'm Pope of the world, and you don't have to worry about me being this Americanist mole in the heart of the papacy. I have to admit, though, as an American, it's somewhat bracing when, he stands up. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold still after 2 weeks. When he stands up and speaks in English with just a straightforward American Midwestern tonality and accent. I mean, we're used to Pope speak like Pope John Paul would come to America and say, "Be not afraid, God bless America," that kind of thing. And here, Pope Leo stands up and says, "Hey guys, here's what I talk about today." And, it's like, wow, he is an American.
So the language thing, I think, is really important. It was something that, before the conclave, this is one of the things that I was saying, right? And I kind of feel like I was ahead of the the pack on it, which was that because of the financial difficulties, they've got £4 billion euro deficit in the Vatican. They've got 1.4 billion deficit in the pension fund. And this is a direct result of Pope Francis's 12 years. And really, and especially initially, like you say, I was thinking about, was it Spadaro wrote that article right at the beginning attacking America and American policy. Yeah. So Francis, like they say, he hated the gringos. He really didn't like the Americans, and he spent a lot of time attacking them, which alienated them and alienated the American money. So it seemed to me likely that an American candidate would be floated just in order to bring the states and the money back, to the Vatican.
Yeah, a lot of people,
not just cynically, I think that sort of sensibly, and he's obviously got a lot of experience running the Augustinian order and everything. So between that fact and the fact that, what is it, 20% of the world's population speak English, and his command of Spanish, and he's got a big, he's covered a big swath of the world with those two languages alone.
Yeah.
He's really going to have a bigger reach, isn't he?
Very much so. It's good to be a polyglot and be Pope. I really think, and it's no fault of his, really. One of the deficits of Pope Francis was that he did not speak a lot of language. I think he spoke Italian and Spanish, and that was it. And so I think there was a barrier there between Francis and other linguistic groups that we're not going to see with Pope Leo. I think you're right. A lot of us were thinking, well, an American will never be Pope for a lot of reasons. But maybe the fact that he is an American played in his favor this time, because a lot of the cardinals might have been looking at, I mean, if you look at the past 12 years under Francis, American donations to Rome have just cratered. And you said it well. I mean, Pope Francis made no bones about the fact that he couldn't stand the United States, couldn't stand conservative Catholics in the United States. And so I think that caused those things to crater. And the cardinals might have thought, well, this is the best of both worlds. We're getting an American, and we can get American money, but he's not quite as American as a Dolan or something, because he is also a Peruvian, and so on. So he's like this halfway house figure. So you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think it's a very clever move. But I do wonder to what extent they knew. Like, it does seem very providential to me, because they can't have known him very well. He's only been in the Curia for a couple of years, hasn't he? Have you got any insight into how he got to the position? It's because it seems strange that he's come straight out. He seems, like he's well in with Pope Francis. I would have thought the Spanish speaking would be a big part of that, and his experience in South America would have endeared him to Pope Francis. But he's literally been appointed, and he's come straight out with bringing on board Orthodox Catholicism, hasn't he? It seems like,
yeah, it seems. Well, it's no big mystery. I mean, his career was helped by Pope Francis. I mean, it was fast tracked by Pope Francis. He was, head of the Augustinian order. Then he gets made a bishop, and then he gets called to the Curia. Then he's made a cardinal, and all of that was under Pope Francis. And let's not play down too much the fact that that's going to put in the heart and soul of Robert Prevost a certain gratitude and appreciation for Pope Francis. He is the man who promoted him. And all that being said, there is an old interview that Robert, when he was bishop, when he was priest, Prevost said that when he was head of the Augustinian order, he had several run-ins with Archbishop Bergoglio of Buenos Aires, and that they didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. And he thought to himself, well, that's that. When Francis became Pope, he thought, I'll never become a bishop, that's for sure. Thank God I'm never going to be a bishop, because I know Bergoglio doesn't really care for my views too much. So it's testimony, actually, though, to, kudos. I'm critical of Pope Francis, but kudos to him for recognizing in, Father Prevost a man of great intellect and great spirit. So,
I'm a bit more cynical than you. I was in Tennessee recently with the team. We had a meeting with some Vatican insiders, and one of the guys who contacted us from the Vatican, who we had a sort of meeting with, was saying that we were discussing the way that Francis had packed the conclave, but it's much more. It seems the reality is much more chaotic than that. For example, there's a report of one bishop who came in, and Pope Francis said, "Oh, he's a good-looking man. Put him down on the list for cardinal." And literally after a 5-minute meeting, as a result of that, made him a cardinal. You've also got this, Bychok, the Australian-Ukrainian guy, 45, the youngest cardinal, who was purely made a cardinal to spite the guy who should have been made a cardinal because he criticized Francis. So.
Or that there's a cardinal from Mongolia, which has 6,000 Catholics, all because when Pope Francis went to Mongolia, he met this bishop there for 5 minutes and said, "Oh, okay, I'm going to make this guy a cardinal." That's just not the way to pass out red hats, and in my opinion, precisely because you nailed it, Mark. The conclave is important. The men who are going to elect the next pope are going to come from those ranks. And so you don't just toss into those ranks willy-nilly people that you really don't know who they are and what they stand for. It's just not a good way to do it.
Absolutely. And do you think that there was something,
Do I
like, it
think what?
really does seem something of the Holy Spirit was engaged in this conclave, though, doesn't it?
Oh, it does seem so. It seems to me that the choice of Pope Leo was providential. Uh, in a lot of ways, when the white smoke came out and it was such a fast conclave, all of the people that I know and I stand with, we were just convinced it was going to be Cardinal Parolin, because the wisdom on the street was, amongst the pundits, if it's fast, it's Parolin. So I saw that white smoke come out and I thought, oh, geez, it's going to be Parolin. But in retrospect, in hindsight, the fact is the conservative cardinals had enough votes to block a more liberal candidate, and the liberal candidates had enough votes to block a more conservative candidate. And so the last man standing would have been Robert Prevost, all right, a theological centrist, a man known for administrative skill and so on. And they figured, well, okay, we're going to go with this. So I really think Prevost was a compromise candidate. But the Holy Spirit, I think, was working in the machinations of the cardinals looking for this compromise. I think the Holy Spirit was there, absolutely.
So we've got a man now who, for the first time in the history of the papacy, was formed after the council, haven't we? How do you think that's going to affect the way that he reigns as Pope?
Well, not much, actually. I mean, he's 69. He's 3 years older than I am. And so, yeah, I wasn't born. I was born before the council, but have no memory of it. So he and I were raised in the American Midwest, both of us, in the same general era. And the fact is, Vatican II was very important in the life of the church in those immediate 10 or 15 years after the council, mostly for the negative. And he had to experience that as well. But I think, make no mistake about it, this is going to be a pope of Vatican II. He's already made statements. For example, sent a letter to the Jewish community, chief rabbi in Rome, and to the American Jewish Federation just the other day, affirming his devotion to the Vatican II document on interreligious dialogue, Nostra Aetate. The Vatican Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue just issued a letter 3 days ago on Buddhist Catholic relations that reaffirmed Nostra Aetate. And he's made a few comments himself about Vatican II and remaining committed to it. So I think what you're going to see is a pope who is, he's not a Pius the 13th. He's going to be more of a really, despite his name, I think he's going to be more of a John Paul III, more than a Pius the 13th. That's so, any traditionalist who is harboring some hope that he's a closeted trad, I think is going to be disappointed. And this is what I mean when I describe him as a centrist. He's going to very much want to be in continuity with all of the papacies of the council and put his stamp on what that means. But I think also he is going to offer an olive branch to the traditionalist world by making the Latin Mass more available. I do think so.
Well, we've got you on, and you are a professor of theology. We could talk a bit about that, because I've heard there's some stir. Obviously, Nostra Aetate, I feel, when I was studying, was the most controversial or difficult to understand in terms of the hermeneutic of continuity. How would you explain the role of Nostra Aetate? And I mean, obviously the argument is that it's a development of doctrine in the line of Newman, but at the same time, it was a big turnaround, wasn't it, from the
Yes and no. It was a turnaround from the church's more recent history, but not necessarily her more ancient history. I have an article coming out in the Pillar, hopefully today or tomorrow, on this very topic. And you ask a very complex question.
Sorry.
Because it requires some theological unpacking, which is that, in the early church, the church fathers espoused the doctrine, for example, of the logoi spermatikoi, that seeds of the word can be found outside of the confines of Christianity. And the seeds of that word are the preparation for the gospel that you can then build on. And so they had the early church fathers had this sort of spoils of Egypt mentality, all right, with regard to pagan religiosity, which is that we're going to purge of its errors, we're going to combat its errors, but at the same time, we're going to acknowledge and embrace those elements of pagan religiosity that we can Christianize and, in a sense, make our own in a deeply Catholic way. So there is in the tradition that this more dual approach of purging error in other religions while at the same time affirming that goodness and truth can be found there. That had been, in a sense, that sort of more sophisticated hermeneutic about how to approach the religions of the world. Let me back up a second too. I mean, go back to St. Paul at the Areopagus when he says to the Greeks, "Oh, look at that! You worship this unknown God, and I'm here to tell you who that unknown God is, Christ." And so what he's sort of acknowledging, Paul, is that there is this inchoate, vague, riddled with error, but still true, questing after God amongst the Greeks. Even the Jews referred to righteous Gentiles as God-fearers. So it's simply wrong to approach a scorched earth approach that says other religions are simply error factories of demonic deception, as you hear with Bishop Schneider sometimes, which I have criticized. So but sort of the post-Reformational church, the church was under siege from the Reformation. It was under siege from the Scientific Revolution. It was under siege from the Enlightenment. It was under siege from the French Revolution and all of the forms of secular anti-clericalism in the political realm. And then the sort of spear thrust to the heart of the old Christendom was the removal of the Papal States and the unification of Italy. So the fact is the church went into a kind of siege mentality, a fortress mentality, where everything outside of the church is simply error, 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 error to be combated, to be fought. And the church's defense, that's why I listed all those things. I mean, it was right. You know, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. All right. And just because, you know, the church had all these enemies, it didn't mean they weren't really enemies. I mean, they were. And so for a time, the church did adopt this fortress Catholicism, everything else is an error mentality. Vatican II went out of its way to say no to that model. If there was a rupture, it was a no to the scorched earth fortress Catholicism model. And Nostra Aetate is reflective of that. It's saying Christ, I mean, if you look at the entirety of the council, it's a very Christocentric council. The council makes very, very clear salvation comes through Christ and only through Christ and his church, period. But that doesn't mean that seeds of the word can't be found in other religions. And in an effort at, in a sense, a more Irenic, non-contrarian approach to dialogue with those religions, especially Jews. Remember, Vatican II happened still in the shadow of the Holocaust. Especially with Jews, they're saying, look, we're going to, in a sense, adopt this more Irenic approach. Now, I'll be the first to admit, however, despite all that I believe in all of that comes at a time when our culture had moved into a rampant religious indifferentism and relativism. And so if the council is guilty of anything, I think it's a certain naivete about the willingness of other religions to dialogue honestly with us, or the willingness of secularity honestly to dialogue with us. I think that the council believed there was a bigger reservoir of goodwill out there towards the church than there was. So it was a two-edged sword. I'm not here trying to paint some sort of Pollyanna picture of, oh, it was just all greatness, but because there was a downside to it.
Yeah, and we've seen that. I suppose the other side of that is Lumingencium 8, you know, where the church was saying, look, and I've experienced this in my own, you know, life and ministry, if you like, that you can't meet someone who's an evangelical Christian, see their love for Christ and, you know, be in fellowship with them without saying there is something, they've got something of the faith. And that is Lumingencium 8 in a way, isn't it? That you can see the bit of the faith they've got from the Catholic Church, but they might not recognize that they've got that bit.
Oh, absolutely. And once again, that's a positive and it's a negative. It's a positive in the sense that we can now recognize strong elements of the church and true faith amongst our Protestant brothers and sisters. But the downside is that the ecumenical dialogues that have taken place since the council often descended into a kind of pablum, into a sort of meaningless drivel about common aims and common goals. I mean, seriously, how do you have ecumenical relations with a Protestant group, say like the Episcopalians, that embraces transgenderism and abortion and all these sorts of things? By what happens in those ecumenical dialogues is that they ignore all that. They ignore the fact that, oh, you guys ordain women, you ordain gays, you have gay marriage, you think abortion is okay. You just ignore all of that and say, well, let's focus on the fact that we both love the poor. All right. That is not, I think, proper ecumenical dialogue.
We saw that in Francis's papacy a lot, didn't we? We saw Pachamama, we saw in wearing the headdress and, getting blessed by native Canadian peoples. How do we reconcile that? Like that, the Jesuits are often accused of syncretism, aren't they? From that, and obviously Pope Leo has got this wonderful missionary dimension. One of the criticisms of Vatican II was that it diminished that missionary zeal because it diminished that ex ecclesia nulla salus sort of attitude that we had. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I had an article. I hate to keep referencing my own articles, but
no, do it, please.
In Catholic World Report several months ago now, but recently, in which I pointed out this is the great, to use a phrase from American politics in the year 2000, this is the great hanging chad of the theology of our time. The church has clearly moved beyond a very, very narrow reading of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. It's clearly moved beyond that into a more expansive reading of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. But the question would now rise, has the definition of extra ecclesiam become so expansive as to render the doctrine meaningless and pointless? Well, yes, the church is necessary for salvation, but we really don't know how. It's in God's hands or whatever. And it is a great unresolved theological tension right now. I mean, even the article I wrote was a sort of meditation on something, an interview that Pope Benedict gave in 2016. He wasn't Pope anymore. All right. In 2016, interview he gave to Father, I can't think of it now. But he said the same thing. He said, look, we've lost the missionary zeal because we've lost the sense that all non-Catholics are in danger of going to hell. On the other hand, he says, we can't really stay in that position. We can't stay in the position of the massa damnata. The church has clearly moved beyond massa damnata. And yet, he said, we really haven't come to grips with everything that means. And really, a lot of theological work still has to be done in this regard. And I feel exactly the same. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have a theological answer to that question. I do not want to embrace the idea that the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived, being outside of the Catholic Church, are in hell. I don't want to embrace that idea. But I also don't want to embrace the idea that therefore the church is not necessary for salvation in some sense. So it's a tricky question, and I don't really have the answer for it.
It's one of the things that really interests me, I have to say. And I think we've talked about it before. I seem to remember, in light of, Bishop Barron, and obviously you're a great von Balthazar scholar, and it sort of comes down to this often erroneous misreading of von Balthazar, doesn't it? That
but that tendency is there in Balthazar. I mean, my main complaint about traditionalists who are always going after Balthazar's views on hell, and dare we hope that all are saved, isn't so much that that they're wrong to criticize that view. That's a view open to criticism. Balthazar himself acknowledged this is a view open to criticism. It's that I wish he had never written that book, because it's at the tail end of his career. It's far downstream, really, from the rest of his theology. And the fact is, von Balthasar's theology is beautiful, profound, rich, complex. John Paul loved it. Benedict loved it. And it's a great boon to the church, but it's going to be just shoved to the side by so many in the church because, well, Balthazar, he believed everybody's going to heaven. So I'm saying, yeah, he's misunderstood, but I understand the criticism nevertheless. I share Balthazar's view that dare we hope that all are saved, but
it's in the Fatima prayer, isn't it? After all,
well, yeah. I mean, I'm not here to criticize Balthazar's view, since I embrace it, but I'm also would be the first to say I think that those who are a little bit leery of it are not entirely wrong, because what they're sensing is that there is this unresolved tension. That you can embrace Balthazar, but then what? What does that mean in terms of extra ecclesiam and so on? Balthazar himself never really addressed that.
It's often said, when I was studying, I remember being taught that in the shadow of any of the great councils, there's a real period of, discombobulation, if you like, where the church is kind of working it out. And that might take decades, it might take centuries to work out that sort of tension.
There's also been, though, Mark, failed councils. And so I think the verdict is still out. Let's put it this way. On a theological level, I think Vatican II was a grand enterprise. The theology of ressourcement is throughout all of it's a Christocentric council. There's some Dei Verbum and Lumingencium in particular are magnificent documents and texts and so on. So I'm not here to criticize its theology. But if its aims were pastoral, it's a failure. Yeah. And it may always just go down in history as a failed pastoral council. Its theology will perdure, but it may go down in history as a failed pastoral council. And so, yeah, there's a lot of dust that still has to settle out, but I'll be long dead, I think, before the full view of Vatican II, what its weight is in the tradition, will be resolved.
Thank you. I'm really glad you said that, because I think that needs to be said, doesn't it? And seeing as Pope Leo then has sort of embraced the spirit of no, I'm not going to say the spirit of the council. He's embraced he said that this will be a Vatican II papacy. How aware do you think he is of these unresolved tensions?
I don't know. I hope he is very aware that the council was at one and the same time a profound theological achievement and a pastoral failure. And the failures are grounded in a kind of double naivete that the council fathers had. The first naivete was that they overestimated the internal strength of the faith life of the church. Something has to explain why that faith life collapsed almost overnight. As soon as the lid was lifted off of the ecclesiastical libido by the council, the whole thing just collapsed overnight. Now, you can blame Vatican II for that, but it was more of a catalyst, and the combustibles were there. Ratzinger already said in 1958, as a young priest, in a famous article, The New Heathenism in the Church, where he pointed out, the church might on paper look good, but it only goes to show that statistics lie, because the church is rotting from within. And you go back to Newman was already saying that, and great figures of the 20th century Catholic figures were saying the church is rotting from within. And I think, therefore, the council overestimated the internal strength of the church. The other naivete was that it overestimated, I think, the benign quality of modernity. It overestimated the amount of good that is in the modern world that we can just sort of simply import and Christianize without any further ado. There was a naivete and an optimism there, probably understandable in the fact that they all lived through World War II and they didn't want to return to division and so on. They wanted a more Irenic spirit, but still, that was a naivete in their context. And I hope Pope Leo understands that distinction between the theological achievement of the council and then its pastoral naivete. Even Ratzinger said in an interview, I can't remember where he said, The problem with the council was that it was really a council of theologians for theologians. And we were so intent, he said, on getting the theology right that we ignored the downstream pastoral consequences of what we were doing. And I think that's the council in a nutshell. A great theological achievement that was naive about the full pastoral implications of what they were doing.
Brilliant. So Leo's been explicit about his direction, his conciliar direction, if you like. How do you think that we'll come to an impasse where we've got a situation with a pope who, you know, perhaps the next pope, because we've got 25 years probably minimum if God spares him now, haven't we? And he can do all that great solid work and put everything in place. And then for the next guy, the council is going to be a bit more in the background. Do you think? How do you think that's all going to play out in the next quarter of a century?
Yeah, well, I hope that Pope Leo is such a strong pope that he lays a powerful and good, solid foundation for the next guy. So 20 years from now, maybe all of these issues, most of them will be sort of resolved to a great extent. The council's place in the life of the church will finally sort of be set as here's what's good, here's what's bad, and so on. And so the next pope will clearly be a post Vatican II pope, and probably long after I'm 66. So God willing, if Pope Leo has a long life, he might be the last pope of my lifetime. So I won't live probably to see that next pope. And if I do, I'll be so old, maybe I won't care. I'll be senile and rocking in my chair on the farm.
So that sounds very much like that you think it's important that the Pope clarifies the documents of Vatican II, you know, what's good and what's not good.
Yeah, I think that in many ways has already been done. And so the clarification could simply take the form of doubling down on the many, many things that John Paul and Benedict wrote about the council and its implementation that Pope Francis just summarily ignored or rejected. And I'm hoping that Pope Leo will resurrect the hermeneutic of the council provided by John Paul and Ratzinger. And that would go a long ways towards settling that, as the proper hermeneutic of the council. Francis, we were well on our way, I think, to a resolution of what the council sort of means for the church until Francis came and returned us to an ecclesiology and a hermeneutic of rupture. And that's very clear. That hermeneutic of rupture had been set aside by John Paul and Benedict and dealt with definitively and authoritatively. And along comes Francis and says, no, we're finally going to implement Vatican II. There was that 35-year interruption, of John Paul Benedict, but he wouldn't put it this way, but that's his supporters all say this. All right. John Paul and Benedict were reactionaries who held up Vatican II. And Francis is finally the Pope of Vatican II, which what they meant was, we have a liberal Pope and we like him, and we want Vatican II to be interpreted as a liberalization of the church. And so I'm hoping Pope Leo will simply say, niet, basta, stop, no, enough. Or in Gaelic, galore, which means we have plenty of hermeneutic to deal with, so no new. I'm actually hoping that in some ways, the Pope Leo pontificate is a minimalist pontificate. My dream would be that Pope Leo does not issue a single motu proprio or a single encyclical, that he simply goes about the business of righting the ship and governing the church properly and giving us good bishops and giving us good example and traveling the world to shore up the spirits of Catholics, and to be simply a pope as a pope should be, which is a court of last resort. The central function of the Petrine ministry is to clarify, to unify by clarifying disputed matters. The role of the Pope is not to be this great generator of innovations, this great generator of new ideas and new initiatives. That's not the role. That's not the central role of the Pope. And I hope Pope Leo, at the end of 20 or 30 years, however long he reigns, I hope we can look back and say, yes, he did the right thing by not being too inventive, and enough invention. We have enough of that.
That's brilliant. I think that's a brilliant way to end it. I was going to say, what is your you know, what was your hope for the papacy? And that makes a lot of sense. I'm completely on board with you as well. Just focus on Christ, you know, speak about Christ. And he seems to have done that right from the beginning, doesn't he? And, you know, less talking on the plane.
That's right. I said to one guy here, I won't mention his name, he's famous, and I don't want to drag him into this, but I said, you know, so-and-so, you know, Cardinal Erdo is a great choice, but he's so kind of boring and dull. And this journalist said to me, well, maybe that would be a good thing to have a boring and dull Pope for a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us, Larry. Really do appreciate it. As I said, you know, perhaps we'll put the links to some of your more recent articles in the show notes. I really do appreciate it. Please do catch up with all Larry's work. He writes prolifically, and you can also find all of that stuff on, is it gaudiumexpes22.com?
That's it. Yes.
Excellent stuff. Thank you. Thanks, Larry, and safe journey home after the inaugural Mass. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you very much.